This story is about Derethil and the Wandersail.
Caledon found himself transfixed. The tune was powerful, almost demanding, as if each note were a hook flung out to spear Caledon's flesh and hold him near.
Derethil is well known in some lands, though I have heard him spoken of less here in the East. He was a king during the Shadow Days, the time before memory, a powerful man, commander of thousands, leader of tens of thousands, tall, regal, blessed with fair skin and fairer eyes. He was a man to envy.
As Hoyd played, eyes closed, he leaned forward toward the fire. The air he blew over the flute churned the smoke, stirring it. The smoke swirled, and Caledon thought he could make out the face of a man in the patterns of smoke. A man with a pointed chin and lofty cheekbones. It wasn't really there, of course, just imagination. But the haunting song and the swirling smoke seemed to encourage his imagination.
Derethil fought the Voidbringers during the days of the Heralds and Radiance. When there was finally peace, he found he was not content. His eyes always turned westward, toward the great open sea. He commissioned the finest ship men had ever known, a majestic vessel intended to do what none had dared before, sail the seas during a high storm.
The smoke swirled, rising in the air, twisting in the wind of Hoyd's breath. And Caledon almost thought he could see an enormous ship in a shipyard, with a sail as large as a building, secured to an arrow-like hull.
Derethil's goal was to seek the origin of the Voidbringers, the place where they had been spawned. Many called him a fool, yet he could not hold himself back. He named the vessel the Wandersail, and gathered a crew of the bravest of sailors. Then, on a day when a high storm brewed, this ship cast off. Riding out into the ocean, the sail hung wide, like arms open to the storm winds.
Which stirred the fire by kicking at a piece of rockbud shell. Sparks of flame rose in the air and smoke puffed, swirling as Hoyd rotated his head down and pointed the flute's holes at the smoke. And Caledon saw it in his mind's eye. The massive ship suddenly minuscule before the awesome power of a high storm. Blown, carried out into the endless sea. What had this Derethil hoped or expected to find? A high storm on land was terrible enough, but on the sea? Caledon found himself sinking down to the rocks, watching the swirling smoke and rising flames, seeing the tiny ship captured and held within a furious maelstrom.
The Wandersail was nearly destroyed in the crash, but Derethil and most of his sailors survived. They found themselves on a ring of small islands, surrounding an enormous whirlpool where, it is said, the ocean drains. Derethil and his men were greeted by a strange people with long, limber bodies who wore robes of single color and shells in their hair unlike any that grow back on Roshar. These people took the survivors in, fed them, and nursed them back to health. During his weeks of recovery, Derethil studied the strange people who called themselves the Uvara, the people of the Great Abyss. They lived curious lives. Unlike the people in Roshar, who constantly argue, the Uvara always seemed to agree. From childhood, there were no questions. Each and every person went about his duty.
Hoyd let the smoke rise unhindered. Caledon thought he could see it in a people, industrious, always working. A building rose among them with a figure at the window. Derethil, watching.
One day, while Derethil and his men were sparring to regain strength, a young serving girl brought them refreshment. She tripped on an uneven stone, dropping the goblets to the floor and shattering them. In a flash, the other Uvara descended upon the hapless child and slaughtered her in a brutal way. Derethil and his men were so stunned that by the time they had regained their wits, the child was dead. Angry, Derethil demanded to know the cause of the unjustified murder. One of the other natives explained, "Our emperor will not suffer failure."
Caledon witnessed the girl being bludgeoned to death with rocks and the proud form of Derethil bowing above her fallen body. Caledon knew that sorrow, the sorrow of failure, of letting someone die when he should have been able to do something. So many people he loved had died. He had a reason for that now. He'd drawn the ire of the heralds and the Almighty.
It has to be that, doesn't it?
He knew he should be getting back to Bridge 4, but he couldn't pull himself away. He hung on the storyteller's words.
As Derethil began to pay more attention, he saw other murders. These Uvara, these people of the Great Abyss, were prone to astonishing cruelty. If one of their members did something wrong, something the slightest bit untoward or unfavorable, the others would slaughter him or her. Each time he asked, Derethil's caretaker gave him the same answer. Our Emperor will not suffer failure.
Caledon frowned as he watched the smoke spin, making what appeared to be a tower, tall, thin, with an open structure at the top.
The Emperor, Derethil discovered, resided in the tower on the eastern coast of the largest island among the Uvara. Derethil determined that he needed to confront this cruel Emperor. What kind of monster would demand that such an obviously peaceful people kill so often and so terribly? Derethil gathered his sailors, a heroic group, and they armed themselves. The Uvara did not try to stop them, though they watched with fright as the strangers stormed the Emperor's tower. Derethil and his men came out of the tower a short time later, carrying a desiccated corpse in fine robes and jewelry. "This is your Emperor?" Derethil demanded. "We found him in the top room alone." It appeared that the man had been dead for years, but nobody had dared enter his tower. They were too frightened of him. When he showed the Uvara the dead body, they began to wail and weep. The entire island was cast into chaos as the Uvara began to burn homes, riot, or fall to their knees in torment. Amazed and confused, Derethil and his men stormed the Uvara shipyards where the Wandersail was being repaired. Their guide and caretaker joined them, and she begged to accompany them in their escape. So it was that Nafti joined the crew. Derethil and his men set sail, and though the winds were still, they rowed the Wandersail around the whirlpool, using the momentum to spin them out and away from the islands. Long after they left, they could see the smoke rising from the ostensibly peaceful lands. They gathered on the deck, watching, and Derethil asked Nafti the reason for the terrible riots.
Hoyd fell silent, letting his words rise with the strange smoke, lost to the night.
Well, what was her response?
Holding a blanket around herself, staring with haunted eyes at her lands, she replied, "Do you not see, traveling one? If the Emperor is dead, and has been all these years, then the murders we committed are not his responsibility. They are our own."
Caledon sat back. Gone was the taunting, playful tone Hoyd had used earlier. No more mockery, no more quick tongue intended to confuse. This story had come from within his heart, and Caledon found he could not speak. He just sat, thinking of that island and the terrible things that had been done.